You turn my morning into dancing. You turn my morning into dancing. Your love changes everything. There's something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. Changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. Changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. Changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. Changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. Changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes every. You turn my morning into dancing. 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 'Cause your love changes everything. Your love changes everything. You turn my morning into dancing. You turn my morning into dancing. You turn my morning into dancing. 'Cause your love changes everything. Your love changes everything. Oh, there's something about your love. Something about your love changes everything in my body. Oh, something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. It changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. It changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. Changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. Changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. Changes everything. Something about your love. Something about your love changes everything. You turn my morning into dancing. You turn my morning into dancing.
Good morning, Rooted Men. Matt Ryan from the Rooted Ministries. Pleasure to be with you this morning. You can see my office behind me is becoming more of a mess all the time. Maybe next time I'll have some of those piles worked through. You can tell how good work's going by how much of a mess I have behind me. Happy to have you with me this Friday morning. I see there's peaks of sunshine, and they're saying maybe we hit 30 by Monday. Boy, that'd really be something. I don't know about you, but I've run through my whole winter supply of firewood already. I'm having to run the heat a lot more than I'd like to, so we're definitely ready for things to kind of stabilize a little bit. It's a funny habit that I always talk about the weather, and I noticed yesterday Tom started with talking about the weather too, and it's such a good icebreaker for every part of our lives because it's a shared experience. But I guess that is a good transition into what we're reading today, speaking of shared experience. So working our way through Judges, and of course, Judges is more of a historical documentation, I guess, of what life was like during this time. And what we see it as Christians, of course, we read it as this cycle of human sin, breaking the love relationship with God, breaking the covenants with God, slipping away, failing, rebelling, getting snapped back to reality when God treats them poorly for it, and then eventually doing it again and again and again and again, and it keeps going on. And for me, this is, it's almost, I want to say, the meat of the Old Testament. So much of the Old Testament is dedicated to telling the story of God's faithfulness met with man's unfaithfulness. And this cycle paints a picture that's truly hopeless, right? How can we ever be atoned with God? How can we ever live up to our end of the bargain for these promises that he makes, right? He promises the people of Israel all these good things, and they just can't do the one thing he asked for. They just can't stay in that loving relationship. And that's us, right? We have so much trouble with all the competing interests for our attention, so much trouble with just staying on that target. And I think that's part of what makes it so important for us to be studying these words, to be studying these books. A lot of people want to just talk about the gospel or just talk about the New Testament and Acts, and it's so important. But without the understanding of the hopelessness of man, the story of our redemption is not as powerful. And I think it's so important for us to remind ourselves by looking back. And we often look with judgment, right? We even look at the disciple stories with judgment. Oh, how dumb were they? They didn't even know. They had him all along. All these kind of things we tend to think and say. But the reality is, when we're living in these moments, we're so often living the same kind of way. But looking back, looking and reading the historical context, right? The continued turning away, the continued worshiping of other gods, and the polytheism, and doing what felt good at the day, what the society is saying is right at the time, because everyone thinks the culture they're growing up in is right. Right now, every day that anyone has ever lived has been the most evolved time in human history. Think about that. We look at all this stuff as its ancient past. Well, to them, it was their very present day. And they believed, because this was the time in their life, that this was an evolved time, right? So be patient with these people. Take a grain of salt and kind of resist that judgment, because that dismisses our time and attention to be putting ourselves in their shoes and really be understanding, because that, I think, is the point of studying the Old Testament. Learning and really understanding the depth of our brokenness, the depth of hopelessness. And of course, we know now that Judges is just crying out for Jesus to come. All these centuries before he would come, they're crying out for someone who would be sinless, who would be pure, who could guide us to redemption. Now, they didn't know it would be God's Son. Of course, they didn't know it would be Jesus, but they knew what they were asking for. So I kind of look at this, or, I kind of like the perception or the thought that this part of Judges really sets up the rest of the book and sets up the walk toward Jesus coming to be the one they're looking for. So we see that then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth, I think. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken and as the Lord had sworn to them. So they were severely distressed, which I think is a funny way of putting it. I think we might be more than severely distressed if given over to plunderers, but a lot of people would see this and view it as, this is God not being faithful. He promised us the good things. He promised us the land of milk and honey and golden times and generations of prosperity. Imagine how much it breaks his heart to go through this over and over and over again. And the thing you got to wonder, because it's natural to ask, did any of that surprise him? Did the depth of our brokenness and depravity surprise him? Well, of course it didn't. So was the point of all that to teach us that today, living a life that is covered, a life where we are viewed as sinless by our Father because of Jesus' atoning sacrifice, was this all just to teach us what it looked like? The wrath and ire that we stir up in God when we break our vow of love with him? It seems weird, doesn't it? That these people would live these lives. But regardless of that purpose, whatever it was, we can gain from it the understanding, right? I've been talking a lot lately about living vicariously through other people's lessons, right? We learn so much from what Paul experienced. We learn from other people's experience. And there are very serious consequences in here. The punishment for sin is death. Nothing more needs to be said about that. It's straightforward. It's plain. Death is that separation from God eternally. That's what we deserve. And we know that. And some of us wallow in that. But until we get to that understanding of how rock bottom our hope is, if this all counts on us, before we get there, we got to look at and understand what that depth is. And then the true understanding that that's why Jesus came and died for you and me. That we would never know the punishment we were due. That he died to take my sin and to give me the grace and the covering of atonement that I could not achieve. That God, through generations, watching humans walk away from him, turn their back on him, worship other gods, violate all he was asking for, found a way. Sent his son. And to that we owe everything. It's easy for this stuff to get rote, gentlemen. It's easy to think about it, for it to run through your mind, but stop and think what it means for you, for your life, that you may live because he died. When you accept Jesus, when you understand and know and believe in him, you never will get to experience all these things we deserve, and even the people of Israel deserved at this time. I hope that's uplifting. It sure is to me. What a mighty God we serve. And what a tremendous gift he's given us. Don't ever lose sight of that, gentlemen. That's what I got today. I hope that's a good word for you. Challenges you, carries you through the day, encourages you, refreshes you, gives you what you needed. For our Father is always speaking to us through his word. Let's make it a great day, gentlemen. We'll make it a firmly rooted day. And may someone see Jesus in us today.